Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening, middle of the night, whenever you happen to be watching this. This is a session on resilience and strengths for psychology of well-being. I am Dr. Rebecca Graber, and resilience is my main research area, so I absolutely love thinking and talking about it and taking a critical perspective on it. So I'm really happy to share with you some knowledge around resilience today and get you thinking about that. And we're also going to be taking a view on strengths as a system of looking at human functioning within positive psychology framework. I want to start with words of wisdom from, I think, somebody who really has always something good to say, and that is Cookie Monster from Sesame Street. Really, truly one of the most important cultural artifacts of our time. And Cookie Monster, in a kind of visual pun that somebody's put together on that famous painting of the wave, it tells us that today me will live in the moment, unless it is unpleasant, in which case me will eat a cookie. And if that's not resilience, then really what is, attempting mindfulness and finding other coping mechanisms when that doesn't work. So I'm really excited to be with you here today. There'll be some opportunities for reflection, so please do have a pen and paper to hand, or have something open on your device in which you can actually write down some of the questions that I'm going to ask you. By the end of the overall lecture today, you should be able to identify, describe, and critically discuss a range of signature strengths, and we'll talk more about what that means in a minute. That's part one is really focused on that. And then in part two, we are going to move on to defining and explaining psychological resilience. So when I first started giving this lecture a few years ago, that term really wasn't well known, and now it really has become quite well known. But I'm going to explore a variety of theoretical perspectives on this and look at specific contexts of use, particularly education, but also we're going to touch briefly at the very end about resilience when living under COVID. So if that is a topic that is challenging for you right now, please do take care while watching it. Hopefully there's nothing in there that's particularly triggering for you, but we're going to speak about it in a general sense. And then finally, I'd like you overall to be able to critically assess the contribution of strengths and resilience to well-being in the face of adversity. Okay, so let's get started. What is it that I mean when I say strengths? So as you know, the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is the APA Bible, as it were, for all of the many ways in which we might exhibit distress and dysfunction, or things that are atypical from the norm, really, is how I'd like to put it. Although really, what is the norm? I don't know anybody who's quote-unquote normal, but, that's what we work with. And in a movement to counter a completely pathological view and take on the study of human experience within psychology, we've had, positive psychology and the psychology of well-being offer a counterpoint to that. And one idea that came out was that, well, maybe if we've got a list of signature distresses, maybe what's needed is a list of signature strengths. So an alternative conceptualization of personal characteristics, and this goes beyond personality traits, even though a lot of what we talk about personality is things that might be problematic, like being neurotic, right? But instead, this is about enumerating things that we might consider to be positive and promotive of mental health. So the values and action framework is assessed using a values in action inventory. It's a list, it's a test you can take, and you can get a sense of what your signature strengths might be using this. And it has an empirical basis that we're going to talk about. And in focusing on it, some research has shown that there's you can get greater benefit over the long term on your well-being from cultivating strengths rather than addressing your weaknesses. So instead of focusing on, okay, what is the thing that is most causing mental distress, or what is the behavior that is leading me down towards that way, instead we focus on cultivating strengths. Where are things going right for me? What are some behaviors that feel good in my body, feel good in my mind, that develop my relationships in a way that's helpful to me? And I want to point out before going on, you're going to see the name Peterson on this. I really want you to distinguish. This is not Jordan Peterson, who's an quote-unquote academic working out of Canada and has started kind of publishing stuff around strengths and leadership, and is, I think, a lot more of a problematic researcher and personality. This is not the same person at all. I double-checked that myself. It's a different Peterson. So, I would not recommend the readings of Jordan Peterson. So, what I'd like us to think about now is to take a moment of reflection, right? So, pens at the ready. I'd like you to pause this video briefly, and I want you to think of somebody who you admire, okay? Who they are, whether they are somebody who's in your personal life, whether they are somebody in the professional sphere or a cultural figure, whoever, right? Think of somebody you admire and think, what strengths do you think they have, right? Again, I'm leaving that open, what that means to you. Take a moment. I'll wait here, but take a moment and do that, and I'm going to share with you some of the ones that I thought of, and feel free, if you like, to share this with your peers afterwards, okay? Right, so assuming now that you've done this exercise, you've taken a few moments to think of someone you admire and what strengths you think they have, let me share with you a little bit of who I would consider. One is Malala, the amazing activist who has done so much to fight for girls' and women's education globally, and obviously survived quite a serious attempt on her life because of that work. I think she shows so much bravery, so much courage, and is also a very effective leader, and manages to make change. I think that's really amazing. Another person who I really admire is Beyonce. Maybe that's, dating me a bit, but I, remember watching Destiny's Child and then seeing her come out as an individual artist and then move into being really, really quite political in such a fantastic way in her work. And I admire the artistic ability she has. And just the creativity that she has, the way that she really brings issues of her lived experience and cultural experiences of other Black people into the fore, the way that she has changed, really changed the genre of music. And she always works with really great people too, and I think that is a strength, to surround yourself with great people. Another one that I really admire is Neil Gaiman, who is a kind of fantasy author, and aside from being a really great storyteller, he's also really nice. I met him one year when I was a bookseller in my hometown of New York, and I was very lucky to work at a place where even though I have no rich and famous people in my circles, people would often come to give readings, and he did, and he was really nice. Like, he stayed really, really late, until well after the store was then closed, to sign everybody's books, and I thought that was really nice. And then finally, you won't know these people, that is my grandmother and my grandfather. because the people that we admire are also very close to us. I had a very close relationship with them. They were both children of immigrants from Eastern Europe, grew up with next to no money, managed to raise a family, were very, very loving and caring, and gave a lot back to each other, and there's a lot of positive memories there. And so really, like, actually, I think that ability to get through challenging times, to be in a culture that isn't always, or a country that isn't always welcoming to you, is really fantastic, and there's a lot to admire about that. So please do think about and reflect on and share your admirable people. And how does this relate to strengths? Well, as noted, there's a test you can take to see what are your signature strengths. And there is a taxonomy, a characterization, just like in the DSM, of different character strengths. So in my example, I talked about things like creativity. I thought about things like kindness, leadership, teamwork. Let's see what else. Kind of perseverance, bravery, and so we can group things together in terms of cognitive strengths, emotional strengths, social and community strengths, protective strengths, and spiritual strengths. And this kind of comes together along a list of different core virtues. So things like wisdom and knowledge, which involves the acquisition and use of knowledge. So this, as a student, this is something that you are demonstrating strength in right now, I think. Courage, the use of will to accomplish goals in the face of internal and external resistance. And I think that's something as a society we really tend to value, right? When we think about strong people, that's kind of what we often think about. And in a way, I don't know about you, but sometimes I find that actually a bit problematic, because even really strong people feel really weak sometimes and feel really vulnerable sometimes. And I do sometimes wonder about whether this is maybe taking it a bit too far, that we should always be, is there a point at which that can be problematic? But let's come back to that when we talk about resilience. Transcendence, so things that center around having connections to the wider world. Temperance, so having care against excess. And this is something you see in a lot of religious traditions, isn't it? That there's a focus on humility, modesty, forgiveness, and of course justice as well, seeing that we're interested in the foundations of community life and building a just society, and humanity, really, the interpersonal care and befriending of other people. And again, to what extent, it's a question for you, to what extent do you think our society here in the UK in 2021, what virtues do we value? I think we've come to really value humanity a lot more in the last year. But what, and specifically, what strengths do we value? And maybe look back at your list, your identification of a person that you admire, and think, what strengths do they show that are on this list? Are there any strengths they show that you didn't pick up on the first time around? Or looking at this list, which is meant to be a comprehensive list of the different strengths that can be demonstrated. Are there other people that come to mind in your life that demonstrate some of these other strengths? And the argument from the people who study strengths is that there is a convergence in strengths across cultures, right? That actually these are fairly universal. That's their argument. And you are probably asking at this point because you are, second semester, you've developed those critical thinking skills quite significantly. You're probably asking yourself, what is this based on, right? And strengths are derived from the concept of virtues, as mentioned, so things like transcendence, and they are how contemporary cultures interpret and apply those virtues into daily life. Okay? And where did those virtues come from? Well, the authors of this paper, Dalsgaard, Seligman, and Peterson, they conducted an empirical analysis of some very influential philosophical traditions. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Athenian philosophy, so the traditional Greek philosophy, Judaism, and Christianity. And they analyzed key texts from each of these philosophical traditions. And based on those, they suggested these virtues that were common through most or all of, through all of those philosophical traditions, finding that they converged across cultures and across historical periods. What they did say was that even though they believed that each of these virtues were present in each of these traditions, they said that different traditions valued some of the virtues more. So transcendence is more important in Buddhism, for example, whereas forgiveness, I think, is quite important in Christianity. But justice and humanity were the most ubiquitous of these. So this is something very interesting to think about. But I think and a lot of, it's a fantastic start, I think, in examining these key texts. And their ideas is that these are the things that persisted and were most influential. But there are some key limitations to the strengths idea. And as we reflect on this, I hope that you'll see through the lecture as it proceeds that these limitations can enter into dialogue with the concept of resilience. So, some limitations to the idea of strengths. One is that there may be a focus on essentialist individual traits, right? So, for example, let's take the idea of leadership. While ideas around leadership, I think, are in a moment of changing as we see structures of leadership change, and as we see people who've been historically excluded from leadership, such as women and people of color, they've, kind of taking moments now. A lot of the strengths are things that are meant to be about us as individuals and are meant to be fairly trait-like. They're not processes, they're things that you are. You are creativity, you don't do creativity. I know that that's not the case. Creativity is something that you do, but the way that that's interpreted is that you feel forgiveness, you feel kindness, or you express kindness as an individual. It's not, for example, that you are within a community in which kindness is characteristic, right? It's about you. And perhaps this is just a natural outcome from the idea that this should be a counterpoint to the DSM, which is also individualistic, right? Societies don't have depression, individuals have depression, according to the DSM. So this may or may not be a significant strength depending on what you think about it, but I think that it can be a bit problematic because we are individuals, but we are also individuals in relationship with other people and within certain historical and social and cultural moments. There's also this idea that you can only eat from the set menu. So these traditions that they looked at, they are not indicative of everything, every philosophical tradition that there are. What is missing from the texts that Dalsgaard and all looked at? Well, there's no indigenous Aboriginal traditions. People indigenous to Australia, there's nothing of that. There's no indigenous to North America. Those traditions are not represented, and those traditions have a very, very different mindset, belief system, cultural system than, for example, Christianity. So there are entire belief systems that actually were very influential, but also have been eliminated largely from historical records, sometimes through very active persecution, right? And terms that were really removed from culture in a quite systematic and intentional way. For example, with Indigenous Americans. Those concepts were explicitly removed from culture. So if they are not present in the same influential way within United States culture, it's not necessarily because they have no validity, it's because they were removed. One might also think about who contributes to those written texts. And I myself am Jewish, and I find it very interesting reading about Jewish feminist counterpoints to some of the main written texts, which, because of just historical record and historical traditions around who could be a practicing rabbi, who could study Torah, it was written by men. Right? And that's not exclusively to Judaism. That is Christianity as well. That is, to some extent, but a lesser extent, Hinduism and Buddhism. And in Athenian philosophy, again, it's just men. You may not think that's problematic, but many, many people would. And so having strengths that come just from that, it maybe is incomplete, right? There's also a really interesting question that I think we might pose from a psychological perspective, which is, can these characteristics can they be developed? Can they be improved upon? Can you practice them? Can you grow in them? And if so, how, right? So if the evidence shows that you can focus on these strengths and have greater impact for your well-being than if you were focusing on so-called deficiencies, which ones are most amenable to being developed and changed? And how does that work? So this is a really interesting question. There are also interesting critiques from a social constructionist perspective, which, we could say that strengths are foci for development. So, for example, if you know that you feel that you are really good at being kind, and that's this personal strength for you, so you want to focus on that and develop that further. There's questions about how people interpret that strength in practice. So an example, a thought experiment for you is, what do we mean when we think about leadership? A lot of times we might think about people who speak boldly and with vision, and who bring people along with them, right? Stand up to injustice. They're really strong. They might be very articulate. They're very loud in impact. But what about people who lead through facilitation, through stepping back and encouraging people who don't often take the podium to do so? What if they lead through collaboration and consensus? That may not be recognized as easily, and yet it is a very effective leadership style, right? And what we consider to be the enactment of that strength, again, is really cultural. And again, think as well about creative people who are doing creative things. How many examples are there of artists who were unappreciated in their time and who we now look back at and say, wow, they were doing something really amazing, right? And there's just, again, some empirical questions about how strengths relate to happiness and what kind of well-being they might relate to. Are they related to happiness, mood, subjective well-being, life satisfaction? So again, not throwing it out entirely, but if we want to use strengths as a helpful lens for looking at human psychology, there are just questions that we need to develop and work from. And another limitation that I think we can offer is where within this taxonomy is the reference to context, to daily challenges, trauma, or adversity. Can you demonstrate the same signature strengths when you're going through a tough time or when things are going pretty well for you? And again, you might think about this last year. You might have strengths that you didn't even know that you had until you were put under this challenge. You might also have some strengths that really haven't got a look in this year because of the nature and intensity of what's happened. And so that really, I think, highlights something about how we conceptualize strengths and what we mean by it. And if we start to bring in a lens of daily challenge, of trauma and adversity, then we start to get to an idea about growth through adversity, learning through adversity, adaptation and change through adversity, and then we kind of start to land in resilience. So I'm going to ask you to not even pause the video. I'm going to end part one after this. And think of someone who has thrived through significant adversity. What you characterize as significant adversity, that is up to you. And again, this might be somebody who's personal to you, or it might be somebody who's out in the world. How would you describe their resilience? What makes you think, oh, this person has thrived in the face of what they've faced? And I'll reflect back on my people. Actually, no, I'll share them now. The first group of people that I actually think of as being resilient are my colleagues. I won't say me, I don't know, but my colleagues, because, you know, it's a very challenging thing and a very different thing teaching online instead of being in the same room with you. And I know that you know that, you know, we're on the flip side of it. And we've had to just, you know, really the amount of work behind the scenes that happens for education to come together and having to continually reevaluate how well things are working and how we can better support students and you know, take care of our own lives and responsibilities and relationships as well, and our own well-being as well. You know, knowing what I know, I'm just so in awe of these people and want to share that with you. So this is a screenshot from our Christmas party, which Kendra Meyer kindly shared with us, and we've got some people in some holiday hats. They're not all smiling, but I do assure you that there was a lot of smiling that happened that day. Other people that I thought showed resilience in the face of adversity. Again, Malala, because not only I think is she strong, you can see then that the strength that she has really came through because there was such adversity in her life. Because there was this systematic attempt to deny girls education. And also, you know, she didn't do this on her own. She came from a family background that really valued education and had a lot of resources. Her story really picked up a lot of support from international organizations and key international figures. She's been invited into the corridors of power, given opportunities to articulate her vision and demands. And so there's, you know, it's her, and it's not just her. And I think that's really important to see that she's working to bring other girls and women up with her. Other people that I think demonstrate significant resilience are Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, you might know his name from logotherapy, a therapeutic tradition that focuses on meaning and narrative and has been very influential in psychodynamic thinking and counseling and therapy. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish man who went to a concentration camp during the Holocaust. His entire family was killed during the Holocaust, along with 6 million other people, mostly Jews, but also LGBT people. Roma people, political dissidents, many people as well. And he kind of took a therapeutic role within the camp, really listening to people and helping people. And then at the end of this, he had been a practicing psychologist going in, and he came out with this whole idea that through making meaning, we survive and we thrive, and that even in events as insensible as Holocaust and genocide, we can make meaning from that, and we can grow and change in important ways, and that can be a way of changing society as well. And I think that's incredible. Many people don't go if and when they make it through such situations, they can't give back in that way, and they can't reflect in that way. And it's not to diminish them in saying that it's not a limitation on them. I think that's also a very important self-preservation thing. But that he did that, I think, showed so much resilience, and his particular way of showing resilience was really important. Another person who I thought is very resilient is Maya Angelou, the poet and author and memoirist from the United States. She grew up under significant racist conditions within the U.S. South. She was also assaulted and experienced quite a lot of challenge and adversity in her childhood, and went through a period of time of not speaking, of being selectively mute. And then with connection through her brother and other people, and learning about literature and poetry as a mode of expression, she stepped into that and became a very creative and expressive person, wrote an incredible series of memoirs, starting with the book I Know How the Caged Bird Sings. Such an influential figure within African American literature, but within United States literature, of really spotlighting these really particular and universal things, and creating art that has stood the test of time and continues to inspire people. So those are my thoughts. I hope that you've considered some. Please do have a think, and then I'll join you again for part 2, where we're going to talk about what we mean when we say resilience.